November 21st, 1943. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. Corporal James Weldon crouched behind his Browning M1917A1 machine gun, sweat trickling down his neck despite the pre-dawn chill. He had broken every rule in the manual, and he knew it. The gun sat at an angle no instructor at Camp Pendleton would have permitted, 45 degrees off-center, barrel elevated slightly above horizontal, positioned behind a fallen banyan tree, rather than in the carefully constructed nest his platoon leader had ordered. His assistant gunner, Private Robert Hayes, whispered urgently beside him, "Lieutenant finds out. We're screwed. This ain't the firing position," he ordered. Weldon adjusted his grip on the weapon's handles, eyes never leaving the dense jungle 70 yards ahead, where intelligence reported a Japanese infiltration unit was massing for a dawn assault. Official position gives us maybe 20 degrees of coverage. From there, we'd only hit what's directly in front of us. This angle covers the entire approach from the ravine to the ridge. The whispered argument died as a faint rustling emerged from the darkness. Through his field glasses, Weldon caught the first glimpse of movement shadows detaching from shadows, the glint of a bayonet catching the faint moonlight. The Japanese reconnaissance unit was moving precisely where battalion intelligence had predicted, but in far greater numbers than expected. Not a dozen men, but at least 40. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What happened in the next 90 seconds would later be documented in 5 separate after-action reports, 3 eyewitness accounts, and 1 Congressional Medal of Honor citation. But the true story of how Corporal James Weldon broke every rule in the Marine Corps machine gun manual to devastating effect began 6 months earlier at Camp Pendleton, California, April 2nd, 1943. The Southern California sun beat down on rows of sweating recruits as Master Gunnery Sergeant Frederick Lawson paced before them, his weathered face set in permanent disapproval. Lawson had fought in the trenches of France in the First World War, where American machine gunners had learned the hard way that strictly by the book, positioning often meant death. "The manual says your gun fires in an arc," he growled at the machine gun training class. "The manual says you position your gun perpendicular to enemy approach. The manual says you don't angle more than 15 degrees off-center." He stopped pacing, fixing each recruit with a hard stare. The manual was written by men who never faced Japanese infiltration tactics in the Pacific. Weldon, a former hunting guide from Montana with an uncanny ability to track movement through dense terrain, raised his hand. "Then why follow it, sir?" The question earned him 50 push-ups and a private conversation with Lawson afterward. What Lawson told him that day would save dozens of Marine lives 6 months later. "The Japanese study our manuals too," Lawson had explained, voice low. "They know exactly where we're supposed to place our guns. They know the standard firing arcs. They plan their approaches accordingly. Sometimes, Weldon, the best tactic is the one that isn't in any manual." When Weldon deployed to Guadalcanal with the 1st Marine Division, his platoon was immediately assigned to defensive positions around Henderson Field, the vital airstrip that both sides recognized as the key to controlling the island. Lieutenant Warren Brooks, his platoon leader and a recent graduate of Officer Candidate School, insisted on textbook machine gun placement guns, positioned in reinforced nests with clear fields of fire directly perpendicular to likely enemy approaches. During his first 2 weeks on Guadalcanal, Weldon observed something the officers seemed to miss. The Japanese night infiltrations never came straight on. They came at oblique angles, probing for the gaps in the American fields of fire. Standard machine gun placement created deadly zones directly in front of the guns, but left dangerous blind spots between positions. October 30th, 1943. A Japanese infiltration team bypassed the Marine lines entirely by exploiting those very gaps, resulting in 17 Americans killed in their sleep. Weldon approached Lieutenant Brooks with a suggestion to reposition the guns at irregular angles to create overlapping fields of fire. "That's not doctrine, Corporal," Brooks had replied stiffly. "The manual is clear on optimal machine gun placement." Sergeant Frank Miller, the platoon sergeant and a veteran of earlier fighting on Guadalcanal, had overheard the exchange. Later, he pulled Weldon aside. "I lost 15 men in July because we had our guns exactly where the Japanese expected," Miller said quietly. "Brooks is a good officer, but he hasn't learned yet that the Pacific doesn't fight by the book. What's your idea?" Weldon explained his theory that angling the M1917A1 at 45 degrees from the expected position, with a slightly elevated barrel, would create a sweeping arc of fire that could catch Japanese infiltrators moving through what they thought were safe corridors between Marine positions. "It's not in the manual because it sacrifices concentrated fire for coverage," Weldon explained. "But against their infiltration tactics, coverage matters more than concentration." Miller nodded slowly. "Next time we get intel about a night probe, set your gun how you think best. I'll take responsibility." November 21st arrived with intelligence from captured documents indicating a major infiltration attempt planned for Henderson Field's eastern perimeter, exactly where Weldon's squad was positioned. Lieutenant Brooks ordered all guns placed according to the manual, with each M1917A1 covering its assigned sector with direct frontal fire. At midnight, with Brooks conducting an inspection further down the line, Sergeant Miller gave Weldon a nod. "Do it your way. Just don't miss." Now, as the first wave of Japanese infiltrators emerged from the jungle into what they believed was a safe corridor between Marine gun positions, Weldon took a deep breath. Hayes fed the belt of 30-06 ammunition into the Browning's receiver as Weldon adjusted his final sight picture. "They're in the gap," Hayes whispered. "They think they're safe." The Japanese soldiers moved with remarkable discipline, 40 elite infiltrators trained to slip through American lines, create chaos in the rear, and disrupt the airfield operations. They had studied American defensive doctrine meticulously. They knew exactly where Marine machine guns should be positioned and precisely how to avoid their fire. What they didn't know was that Corporal James Weldon had positioned his gun exactly where doctrine said it shouldn't be. At 70 yards, Weldon could make out individual faces in the dim pre-dawn light. He waited until the entire unit was committed to the approach, fully exposed in what they believed was a safe corridor between Marine positions. "Now," he whispered. The Browning M1917A1 erupted in a devastating storm of 30 caliber bullets. At the unorthodox angle Weldon had chosen, the gun swept the entire infiltration route with continuous fire. Japanese soldiers, caught completely exposed in what they thought was a safe zone, had nowhere to take cover. The first burst cut down 8 men instantly. The second dropped another 12 as they frantically sought cover that didn't exist. The third and fourth bursts caught the remainder as they attempted to retreat or return fire. Private Hayes fed belt after belt into the weapon, as Weldon maintained disciplined, controlled bursts. In military terms, it was perfect fire discipline short, accurate bursts rather than continuous fire that would overheat the kingdom and barrel. In human terms, it was devastating. Within 90 seconds, the entire Japanese infiltration force lay motionless in the jungle clearing. The firing alerted the entire Marine line. Lieutenant Brooks raced to Weldon's position, expecting to find it overrun. Instead, he found Weldon still at his gun, Hayes beside him, and 40 Japanese infiltrators lying in the open ground before them. "What the hell happened here?" Brooks demanded, staring in disbelief at the carnage. Sergeant Miller arrived seconds later. "Corporal Weldon adjusted his firing position, sir. Caught them in the gap they thought was safe." Brooks surveyed the scene, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding. "That's not standard positioning, Corporal." "No, sir," Weldon replied quietly, "but they were counting on standard positioning." Dawn revealed the full extent of what Weldon had accomplished. 40 Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces, the Japanese equivalent of Marines, and among their most elite troops lay dead in a narrow corridor that, according to American machine gun doctrine, should have been a safe infiltration route. Among the dead was a Japanese lieutenant carrying detailed maps of Henderson Field, complete with marked Marine defensive positions based on standard American doctrine. The infiltrators had been assigned to destroy parked aircraft and ammunition dumps, which could have severely hampered American air operations. Lieutenant Brooks studied the maps, then looked at Weldon's unorthodox gun position. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he turned to the company commander, who had arrived to assess the situation. "Captain, I believe Corporal Weldon deserves recognition for his initiative." The captain surveyed the scene. 40 enemy KIA from one gun position. "I'd say so. Write it up." What followed became known throughout the 1st Marine Division as Weldon's Angle, a fundamental reconsideration of machine gun tactics against Japanese infiltration. Within weeks, Marine defensive positions around Henderson Field incorporated irregular gun placements specifically designed to create overlapping fields of fire that left no safe corridors for enemy movement. For Weldon himself, the aftermath brought both recognition and a heavy burden. The Bronze Star Medal pinned to his chest came with nightmares that would plague him for decades. The image of 40 men cut down in seconds never left him, though he knew with absolute certainty that his actions had saved countless Marine lives. December 5, 1943. 2 weeks after the incident, Master Gunnery Sergeant Lawson received a letter from Weldon describing what had happened. Lawson shared it with the machine gun instructors at Camp Pendleton, and within months, Weldon's Angle became part of unofficial machine gun training for Marines headed to the Pacific. "Sometimes the manual is wrong," became Lawson's new refrain to his students. "The Japanese know our doctrine as well, as we do. The solution isn't always more firepower. Sometimes it's using that firepower where the enemy doesn't expect it." For Japanese forces on Guadalcanal and throughout the Pacific, the incident marked a troubling development. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hayakutake, commander of Japanese forces on Guadalcanal, noted in his personal journal, "American Marines are adapting more quickly than anticipated. Their machine gun tactics have become unpredictable, making infiltration increasingly costly." The strategic impact extended far beyond one night or 40 casualties. Japanese infiltration tactics, which had been devastatingly effective in the early stages of the Guadalcanal campaign, became progressively less successful as Marines incorporated flexible, unorthodox defensive arrangements. Sergeant Miller later explained the significance to war correspondents. "The Japanese were fighting by our book. They knew where our guns were supposed to be, how they were supposed to be employed. Weldon showed us that sometimes tearing up the book saves lives." Lieutenant Brooks, to his credit, became one of the strongest advocates for tactical flexibility. His after-action report acknowledged that strict adherence to doctrine had created vulnerabilities that the enemy had identified and exploited. Corporal Weldon's unorthodox placement of his weapon system demonstrated that adaptation to enemy tactics must take precedence over rigid application of doctrine, he wrote. For the Marines fighting across the Pacific, the lesson was clear. The enemy had studied their tactics, their weapons, and their doctrine. Victory would come not from following the manual perfectly, but from understanding when to break from it decisively. Major General Alexander Vandergrift, commander of the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal, summed it up in a division-wide memorandum. Our enemies have read our manuals. Our advantage lies in our ability to adapt faster than they can anticipate. After Guadalcanal, Weldon's career took him through increasingly desperate battles across the Pacific. On Tarawa, his machine gun section innovated again, developing mobile fire teams that could rapidly reposition to counter Japanese counterattacks. On Saipan, now a sergeant, he trained an entire company in flexible machine gun tactics that broke a desperate Japanese night assault. Japanese intelligence reports began to note the unpredictability of marine defensive arrangements. A document captured on Peleliu revealed the frustration. American machine gun positions no longer follow their established doctrine. Each position appears individually tailored to its terrain, making safe approach routes impossible to identify in advance. This adaptation came at a cost. Marines like Weldon, who employed flexible doctrine, sometimes faced resistance from higher command. Traditional officers occasionally questioned deviations from established procedures, but in the brutal calculus of Pacific combat, results mattered more than rigid adherence to doctrine. By 1944, what began as one corporal's improvisation had evolved into standard Marine Corps practice. Machine gun instructors at Camp Pendleton now taught position flexibility as a core principle, using Weldon's experience as a case study. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. For Weldon himself, the evolution of his tactical innovation brought professional advancement but personal challenges. Promoted to gunnery sergeant by 1945, he struggled with the psychological weight of the lives he had taken and saved. In letters home, he rarely mentioned medals or recognition, focusing instead on the men in his unit and their daily struggles. "The hardest thing isn't killing the enemy," he wrote to his father in Montana. "It's knowing that they're studying everything we do, looking for patterns they can exploit. You can't just be good at following the manual. You have to know when to throw it away." Japanese naval officer Toshikazu Omae, captured on Saipan in 1944, provided American intelligence officers with remarkable insight into how Japanese forces viewed marine adaptability. "We were taught that Americans rely on material superiority rather than tactical innovation," he explained through interpreters. This proved dangerously wrong. American Marines constantly changed their tactics, particularly in defensive arrangements. What worked against them one month failed the next. This adaptive capability became one of the defining characteristics of Marine operations in the Pacific. While the Army often relied on overwhelming firepower and by-the-book operations, the Marines developed a culture of tactical improvisation that kept Japanese forces perpetually off balance. Colonel Victor Krulak, who observed Weldon's technique being employed on Peleliu, later wrote, "The Pacific War was not won solely by industrial might or numerical superiority. It was won by Marines who understood that doctrine is a starting point, not a straitjacket." For James Weldon, the legacy of those 90 seconds on Guadalcanal followed him long after the war ended. Returning to Montana in 1946, he rarely spoke of his experiences. When asked about his Bronze Star, he typically deflected, saying only, "I put my gun where it wasn't supposed to be." The true impact of Weldon's angle extended far beyond one firefight or even the Pacific Campaign. In the decades following World War II, Marine Corps doctrine increasingly emphasized tactical flexibility and adaptation over rigid adherence to established procedures. The principle that doctrine should guide rather than dictate became fundamental to Marine Corps philosophy. Today, instructors at the Marine Corps Machine Gun Leaders course still reference the concept of Weldon's angle when teaching the principles of defensive fires. The lesson remains the same. Understand doctrine thoroughly, then recognize when the situation demands breaking from it. In 1978, 35 years after that night on Guadalcanal, an elderly James Weldon was invited to address a class of machine gun instructors at Quantico. His message was characteristically straightforward. "The manual exists for a reason," he told the gathered Marines. "Learn it completely. Understand why each principle is there. Then recognize that somewhere your enemy is reading the same manual, planning how to use your doctrine against you. That's when you need to think beyond what's written on the page." The lesson of Corporal Weldon's forbidden angle remains relevant in modern warfare. In an era of technological sophistication and doctrinal complexity, the principle remains unchanged. The most effective tactics are often those the enemy doesn't anticipate. As one machine gun instructor at Camp Pendleton now tells his students, "The manual gives you the foundation. Your brain gives you the advantage. Never let doctrine become your limitation." For the 40 Japanese infiltrators who died in 90 seconds on Guadalcanal, the lesson came too late. They had studied American doctrine perfectly and planned accordingly. What they couldn't anticipate was one Marine corporal who understood that sometimes the best tactic is the one that isn't in any manual. The tactical innovation that began with Weldon's unorthodox machine gun placement spread throughout the Pacific theater, becoming one aspect of a broader transformation in Marine Corps combat doctrine. By 1944, as American forces pushed westward toward Japan, adaptability had become the defining characteristic of Marine operations. What began as one corporal's improvisation had evolved into institutional philosophy. February 18, 1945. The evening before the assault on Iwo Jima, Gunnery Sergeant James Weldon sat aboard the transport ship USS Henry, surrounded by young Marines from the 4th Division. Most were replacements who had never seen combat. They listened intently as Weldon shared hard-earned wisdom that wouldn't be found in any manual. "The Japanese have studied our doctrine for years," he explained, voice low but intense. "They know where we're supposed to place our weapons, how we're supposed to advance, what formations we're supposed to use. Tomorrow, when we hit those beaches, they'll be waiting with pre-registered fire on every textbook landing zone." Private Thomas Reynolds, a machine gunner from Oklahoma, barely 18 years old, raised his hand. "So what do we do, Gunny?" "We adapt faster than they can anticipate," Weldon replied. "That's how we survive. That's how we win." The next morning, as landing craft approached the black volcanic beaches of Iwo Jima, Japanese artillery and mortar fire created a maelstrom precisely where Marine doctrine indicated that first waves should establish their positions. But the landing plan had incorporated lessons learned across 2 years of Pacific combat. Instead of predictable deployments, machine gun teams like Reynolds immediately sought irregular positions, establishing interlocking fields of fire that caught Japanese defenders off guard. This adaptive approach saved countless lives, though the cost remained staggering. Of the 70,000 Marines who landed on Iwo Jima, nearly 26,000 became casualties. The battle illustrated the brutal mathematics of Pacific combat that Weldon had come to understand all too well. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the Japanese commander on Iwo Jima, had created a defense specifically designed to counter American tactics. His preparations were meticulous, based on careful study of Marine operations in previous campaigns. But what Kuribayashi couldn't fully prepare for was the Marines' capacity for immediate tactical adaptation when faced with unexpected challenges. Major General Clifton Cates, commanding the 4th Marine Division on Iwo Jima, later observed, "The Japanese expected us to fight according to our doctrine. Our ability to improvise when that doctrine failed kept them perpetually off balance." This capacity for adaptation extended far beyond machine gun placement. Throughout the Pacific Campaign, Marines developed countless tactical innovations in response to specific challenges. On Tarawa, they created specialized demolition teams to reduce fortified positions. On Saipan, they pioneered tank infantry coordination techniques. On Peleliu, they perfected the use of flamethrowers to clear complex cave systems. Each innovation arose from the same fundamental recognition that had led Weldon to angle his machine gun differently on Guadalcanal. When the enemy knows your doctrine, survival depends on transcending it. Japanese military intelligence increasingly noted this adaptive capability with growing concern. A document captured on Okinawa in April 1945 revealed their frustration. American Marines rapidly modify their tactics in response to initial failures. Standard defensive preparations prove insufficient as they continually develop unexpected approaches. This adaptability makes their advances difficult to predict or counter effectively. For James Weldon, the evolution from lone innovator to institutional symbol brought both satisfaction and unease. By Iwo Jima, he had been assigned to a training role, sharing his experience with replacement troops before they entered combat. The responsibility weighed heavily on him. "I tell them what worked yesterday," he confided to his platoon sergeant. "But I worry that tomorrow will demand something entirely different. The Japanese are adapting too." This concern proved well-founded. By late 1944, Japanese defensive doctrine had evolved specifically to counter Marine adaptability. General Kuribayashi's defensive network on Iwo Jima represented the culmination of this approach, a defense designed not with rigid adherence to Japanese doctrine, but with careful study of how Marines had overcome previous defensive arrangements. The resulting battle tested both sides' capacity for adaptation to unprecedented extremes. Marines landed, expecting certain defensive arrangements based on previous experience, but encountered an entirely new approach. The Japanese defense relied not on counterattacks or banzai charges, but on an interlocking network of mutually supporting positions that could not be reduced individually. Private Reynolds, putting Weldon's teachings into practice, survived the initial landing by immediately repositioning his machine gun away from the expected location. His gun team established a firing position behind an unusual rock formation that Japanese observers had not identified as suitable for a machine gun nest. From this unexpected angle, they provided covering fire that allowed an entire company to advance when movement seemed impossible. 3 days into the battle, Reynolds' position came under concentrated Japanese fire. 2 of his team were killed instantly. Reynolds sustained a severe shrapnel wound to his left arm, but continued operating his weapon. When ammunition ran low, he crawled 200 yards through exposed terrain to retrieve additional belts, returning to maintain his position. His actions earned him the Silver Star. The citation read in part, "By maintaining fire from an unexpected position at critical risk to himself, Private Reynolds enabled the advance of Company K when conventional approaches had failed. The legacy of Weldon's innovation lived on in a new generation. Throughout the Pacific Campaign, this pattern repeated countless times. Marines studied Japanese tactics, adapted their approach, gained ground at terrible cost, then faced a new defensive innovation that required further adaptation. The cycle of tactical evolution accelerated with each island campaign, with both sides learning from each encounter. Colonel Robert Cushman, operations officer for the 3rd Marine Division, described this process in a 1945 interview. "We're in a constant tactical dialogue with the Japanese. They study our approach, design countermeasures, implement them on the next island. We study their countermeasures, develop countermeasures, implement them in the next assault. It's a deadly conversation conducted in blood and fire." This tactical dialogue transformed both combatants. By 1945, the Marine Corps barely resembled the organization that had landed on Guadalcanal in 1942. Its doctrine, equipment, organization, and training had evolved dramatically through constant adaptation to Japanese defensive innovations. Similarly, Japanese defensive tactics had progressed from the rigid, doctrine-driven approaches of early war to the sophisticated, terrain-integrated networks of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The human cost of this evolution was staggering. Of the 485,000 Marines who served in World War II, nearly 87,000 became casualties, including nearly 20,000 killed. Japanese losses were even more catastrophic, with entire garrison forces frequently fighting to near-complete annihilation. Behind these statistics lay individual stories of adaptation and sacrifice. In May 1945, as American forces secured Okinawa, Gunnery Sergeant Weldon received a letter from Private Reynolds, now recovering in a field hospital. The young machine gunner's words captured both the practical and philosophical dimensions of tactical adaptation. "I did what you taught us, Gunny," Reynolds wrote. "Put my gun where they wouldn't expect it, saved a lot of lives, lost some too. Keep wondering if there was some other angle, some other approach I didn't see that might have saved more. Guess that's the burden of having choices." This burden, the weight of responsibility that came with tactical flexibility, affected Marines at every level. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers found themselves making life-or-death decisions based not on rigid doctrine, but on immediate assessment of unique situations. The psychological impact was immense. Lieutenant Colonel James Chambers, a battalion commander on Iwo Jima, later reflected, "When you operate strictly by doctrine, there's a certain comfort. If things go wrong, at least you followed procedure. When you encourage adaptation, every decision carries personal weight. Every innovation that fails, every improvisation that costs lives, that stays with you forever." For Japanese defenders, the psychological impact was equally profound but fundamentally different. They observed American forces continually overcoming defensive arrangements that had been meticulously planned and prepared. Each adaptation by Marine forces represented not just a tactical setback, but a philosophical challenge to Japanese military thinking, which emphasized spirit and determination over flexibility and improvisation. Captain Yoshio Omei, a survivor of the Saipan garrison who was captured and interrogated by American intelligence, provided unique insight into this psychological dimension. "We were taught that Americans relied on material superiority rather than spiritual strength," he explained. "When we saw them overcome material disadvantage through tactical innovation, it challenged our most basic assumptions about their character as warriors." This mutual reassessment extended beyond tactical matters to fundamental questions of military philosophy. Marines who had entered the war believing in the primacy of doctrine and firepower came to value adaptability and individual initiative above all. Japanese officers who had dismissed Americans as materialistic and inflexible were forced to recognize their capacity for innovation under pressure. By the summer of 1945, as American forces prepared for the invasion of the Japanese home islands, this evolution had reached its apex. Marine planning for Operation Olympic, the proposed invasion of Kyushu, incorporated unprecedented tactical flexibility. Units were trained not in rigid procedures but in adaptive problem-solving. Equipment loadouts included multiple options for addressing unexpected challenges. Command structures emphasized decentralized decision-making to enable rapid response to changing conditions. Major General Lemuel Shepard, slated to command landing forces for Olympic, explained the philosophy. "We've learned that no plan survives contact with this enemy intact. Rather than trying to create the perfect plan, we're creating Marines who can perfect the plan as circumstances demand." On the Japanese side, defensive preparations reflected a similar evolution. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, tasked with defending Kyushu, developed a defensive scheme that incorporated lessons from Iwo Jima and Okinawa. His approach abandoned many traditional Japanese tactics in favor of flexible defense in depth, designed specifically to counter Marine adaptability. The planned invasion never occurred. Atomic weapons and Soviet entry into the Pacific War led to Japan's surrender in August 1945, bringing the brutal cycle of tactical adaptation and counter-adaptation to an abrupt end. For James Weldon and countless other Marines, the war's conclusion brought relief, but not necessarily peace. The psychological burden of constant adaptation of making life-or-death decisions without the comfort of doctrine remained with them long after the fighting ended. In October 1945, as occupation forces established control over Japan, Weldon received orders to participate in the decommissioning of Japanese military facilities on Kyushu. There, he encountered something unexpected: detailed Japanese intelligence assessments of Marine tactical innovations, including specific analysis of what they termed non-standard machine gun employment. A Japanese intelligence officer, Major Tatsuo Hayashi, had compiled extensive documentation on how Marines like Weldon had broken from doctrine to counter Japanese tactics. His analysis was remarkably insightful, identifying the psychological and philosophical dimensions of Marine adaptability. American Marines display a uniquely pragmatic approach to warfare, Hayashi had written. Unlike Japanese forces, who are bound by tradition and spiritual concepts, Marines readily abandon established procedures when circumstances demand. This represents not inferior discipline, but a different form of discipline, one centered on achieving objectives rather than following prescribed methods. Reading these words in translation, Weldon experienced a profound sense of recognition. What had begun for him as a practical solution to an immediate tactical problem had evolved into something far more significant: a fundamentally different approach to warfare that challenged conventional military thinking on both sides. This recognition spread throughout American military institutions in the war's aftermath. The capacity for tactical adaptation that Marines had demonstrated in the Pacific became central to post-war military doctrine. Training increasingly emphasized problem-solving and innovation rather than rote application of procedures. General Alexander Vandergrift, Commandant of the Marine Corps from 1944 to 1948, specifically cited the tactical flexibility displayed in Pacific campaigns as a cornerstone of the post-war Marine Corps. Our experience against an enemy who studied our doctrine and exploited its weaknesses taught us that adaptation is not merely desirable but essential, he wrote in 1947. The modern battlefield demands warriors who understand principles deeply enough to know when and how to transcend them. This lesson extended beyond military circles to influence American institutional thinking more broadly. The recognition that adaptation often matters more than doctrine, that understanding when to break rules can be more important than following them, became part of the national approach to complex challenges. For individual Marines like Weldon and Reynolds, however, the legacy was more personal. Both men returned to civilian life, carrying the hard-earned wisdom of their Pacific experience. Weldon returned to Montana, where he became a forest ranger, applying the principle of adaptive problem-solving to natural resource management. Reynolds, after recovering from his wounds, studied engineering in Oklahoma, bringing a flexible, pragmatic approach to infrastructure development. Neither spoke much about their wartime innovations. When pressed, Weldon typically deflected, saying simply, "We did what the situation demanded." This understatement masked the profound significance of what they had achieved, not just tactical success in specific engagements, but a fundamental reconceptualization of how American forces approached warfare. The impact of this reconceptualization extended far beyond World War II. In Korea, Vietnam, and subsequent conflicts, American forces consistently demonstrated an adaptability that distinguished them from more doctrine-bound opponents. This capacity for innovation under pressure, for recognizing when the situation demands breaking from established procedure, became a defining characteristic of American military operations. Japanese military thinking evolved similarly, though through a different path. The harsh lessons of the Pacific Campaign led post-war Japanese defense forces to embrace flexibility and adaptation, rather than rigid adherence to doctrine. The Japan Self-Defense Forces, established after the occupation period, incorporated many of the adaptive principles that American forces had demonstrated during the war. In 1975, 30 years after the war's end, James Weldon received an unexpected letter from Japan. Tatsuo Hayashi, the intelligence officer who had studied marine tactical innovations, had tracked him down through military records. Now, a professor of military history at the National Defense Academy of Japan, Hayashi was researching the psychological dimensions of tactical adaptation. "Your innovation with machine gun placement represents something profound," Hayashi wrote. "Not merely a tactical adjustment, but a philosophical statement about the relationship between doctrine and reality. You demonstrated that true mastery lies not in perfect execution of established procedure, but in recognizing when procedure must yield to circumstance." This observation captured the essence of what Weldon and countless other Marines had discovered through hard experience. Doctrine exists to serve objectives, not the reverse. When doctrine becomes an obstacle to achieving objectives, true professionalism demands transcending it. In his reply, Weldon expressed this principle with characteristic simplicity. "The manual gives you fundamentals. Your brain gives you solutions. The trick is knowing when to use which." This wisdom, earned at tremendous cost across the Pacific, transformed American military thinking. Training increasingly emphasized understanding the principles behind procedures rather than the procedures themselves. Leaders at all levels were taught to view doctrine as a foundation for decision-making rather than a substitute for it. The legacy of this transformation extends into the present day. Modern military education places unprecedented emphasis on adaptive problem-solving and critical thinking. Case studies from Pacific campaigns, including examples like Weldon's unorthodox machine gun placement, are still used to illustrate the vital importance of tactical flexibility. For the generation that fought across the Pacific, however, this legacy came at an almost unimaginable price. Nearly every Marine who survived brought home not just physical wounds, but the psychological burden of constant adaptation under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. They had made life-or-death decisions without the comfort of doctrinal certainty, carrying the consequences of those decisions throughout their lives. In 1988, as an elderly man, James Weldon spoke at a reunion of Pacific veterans in San Diego. His message to the assembled Marines, many now in their 60s and 70s, was both tribute and reflection. What distinguished us wasn't courage, both sides had plenty of that, he said quietly. It wasn't equipment or numbers, though those helped. What made the difference was our willingness to adapt when doctrine failed us. We learned faster than they expected. We changed approaches when necessary. We improvised when standard methods didn't work. That adaptability saved lives and won battles. He paused, looking across the room at men who had shared his experience. But it came with a cost. Every innovation, every adaptation carried personal responsibility. When you break from doctrine and succeed, lives are saved. When you break from doctrine and fail, that burden is yours alone. We all carry those decisions with us still. This burden, the weight of personal responsibility that comes with tactical flexibility, remains perhaps the most profound legacy of the Pacific Campaign's lessons. Modern military leaders are taught that true professionalism often means making decisions without the safety net of doctrinal certainty. The principles that Weldon and his contemporaries discovered through blood and fire have become foundational to American military thinking. The irony is inescapable. Japanese forces, who entered the war believing in the supremacy of spirit over material, learned the crucial importance of equipment and firepower. American forces, who entered the war believing in the supremacy of doctrine and material, learned the crucial importance of INT 2000, adaptability and innovation. Each side discovered in the other qualities they had not fully valued in themselves. This mutual transformation, achieved at staggering human cost, represents perhaps the most significant legacy of the Pacific Campaign. Beyond territory gained or lost, beyond strategic outcomes, the fundamental reconceptualization of military philosophy on both sides shaped institutional thinking for generations. For James Weldon, who positioned a machine gun at a forbidden angle on Guadalcanal and changed Marine Corps tactics forever, the legacy was both professional and deeply personal. His innovation saved countless lives, transformed military thinking, and carried him through decades of both pride and reflection. Like many of his generation, he rarely spoke of his own role, preferring to emphasize the collective achievement of adaptation under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. "We learned because we had to," he often said when pressed about his innovation. The alternative was failure, and failure meant death not just for us, but for everything we believed in. That simple truth, that adaptation was not merely advantageous but essential for survival, remains perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Pacific Campaign. In the decades since, military thinkers worldwide have recognized that the capacity to learn, adapt, and innovate under pressure often matters more than initial doctrine, equipment, or even numbers. The young Marine machine gunners who now train at Camp Pendleton still learn the fundamentals of their weapon systems according to established doctrine. But they also learn something more important: when and how to adapt that doctrine to meet unexpected challenges. The spirit of Weldon's innovation lives on in this emphasis on principled adaptation rather than rigid adherence. As Japanese writer Haruki Murakami once observed, "Learning without thought is labor lost. Thought without learning is perilous." The Marines who fought across the Pacific learned this truth through blood and fire, discovering that doctrine without adaptability is insufficient, while adaptation without foundational knowledge is impossible. True mastery requires both the discipline to master established principles and the courage to transcend them when circumstances demand. This balance between foundational knowledge and adaptive innovation remains the cornerstone of effective military operations. The lesson that James Weldon and his contemporaries learned on Guadalcanal, refined on Tarawa and Saipan, and perfected on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, has become institutional wisdom passed down through generations of Marines. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.